New Chapel Hill, a small town in Smith County, Texas, is the kind of place where the air is thick with the scent of pine trees and the streets hum with the rhythm of quiet, predictable lives. In this tranquil setting, neighbors often left their doors unlocked, children played freely in the yards, and the most notable events revolved around Sunday church services. It was an unassuming community where residents trusted each other and shared in each other's joys and sorrows. But in May 2003, New Chapel Hill became infamous for an act so unspeakable that it shattered the peace of this sleepy town forever. This is the story of Deanna LaJune Laney, a devout mother and wife, whose descent into darkness forever changed the lives of her family, her neighbors, and all who bore witness to her chilling crime. Deanna Laney was the kind of woman who seemed to embody all the virtues of her faith. A mother of 3 boys, 8-year-old Luke, 6-year-old Joshua, and 14-month-old Aaron, she devoted her life to their upbringing, raising them in a home steeped in Pentecostal Christianity. She had married Keith Laney, a mild-mannered and supportive husband, and together they cultivated a life centered on God and family. Deanna was well known within her tight-knit church community. She sang in the choir, taught Bible lessons, and attended weekly prayer meetings. Friends described her as kind, soft-spoken, and deeply religious. Her life appeared to be the epitome of a faith-driven existence. But beneath the surface of her serene outward demeanor, Deanna harbored a growing conviction that would eventually consume her. By the spring of 2003, she began sharing with those closest to her that God had been speaking to her. These weren't just feelings of divine inspiration or guidance, they were vivid visions and auditory commands. At first, Deanna's claims about receiving direct messages from God were met with mild curiosity or brushed off as an extension of her deep spirituality. After all, in their religious community, the concept of divine revelation wasn't unheard of. But as weeks turned into months, Deanna's behavior began to raise alarm bells. She became increasingly withdrawn, spending hours in prayer and fasting. She claimed that God had revealed to her that the end of times was near, and that her family had been chosen for a unique purpose in His grand plan. She told friends that her children were special and that their lives had a higher calling. Keith Laney, her husband, began to notice her growing intensity. At night, Deanna would wake him to tell him about her visions. Sometimes she spoke in tears, claiming she felt the weight of a divine test that would require ultimate obedience. Other times, her tone was one of eerie calm, as if she had made peace with what was to come. Despite these unsettling signs, no one, including Keith, could have imagined the darkness that lay ahead. On the night of May 9, 2003, the Laney family settled into their usual routines. It was the eve of Mother's Day, and there was no hint of the horror that was about to unfold. As the clock ticked toward midnight, Deanna slipped out of bed, her movements quiet and deliberate. Earlier that day, she had collected several large rocks, heavy and sharp-edged, from the yard. She believed these stones had been divinely chosen as instruments for what she called God's test. She entered the room of her 6-year-old son, Joshua, who was sleeping peacefully. Deanna knelt beside him and whispered a prayer, asking for strength and guidance. Then, with a single swift motion, she brought the rock down on his skull. The blow shattered the stillness of the night. Joshua screamed in agony, his cries piercing the quiet home. Deanna dragged his small, bleeding body outside, placing him on the ground beneath the stars. "This is what God wants," she whispered. Her task was far from over. She returned inside and approached her 8-year-old son, Luke. The process repeated itself with chilling precision. Another prayer, another swing of the rock, another body carried out into the yard. Deanna then turned her attention to her youngest child, 14-month-old Aaron. Standing over his crib, she hesitated. The baby stirred, his tiny hands clutching the blankets around him. In her mind, she claimed later, God told her to stop, that Aaron was to be spared as a witness to her devotion. Covered in blood, Deanna walked barefoot to her neighbor's house. Her steps were steady, her expression eerily calm. She knocked on the door until it opened, her voice trembling as she delivered the words that would haunt her neighbor forever. "I've killed my boys. I obeyed God." The neighbor, stunned and terrified, called 911. Deanna stood silently as the authorities were summoned, showing no signs of remorse or panic. When law enforcement arrived, they found the gruesome scene Deanna had left behind. Joshua and Luke were discovered in the yard, their lifeless bodies crumpled on the ground. Inside, baby Aaron was unharmed, sitting quietly in his crib. The trial of Deanna Laney captivated the nation. The public struggled to reconcile the image of a devoted, religious mother with the unspeakable violence she had inflicted upon her own children. Deanna's defense team argued that she had suffered from severe postpartum psychosis, a rare condition that can cause delusions, hallucinations, and a complete break from reality. Experts testified that her actions were not driven by malice, but by a warped perception of reality, one where she believed she was fulfilling a divine command. The prosecution, however, painted a different picture. They pointed to the planning involved in the murders, the collection of the rocks, the timing of the killings, and Deanna's coherent confession. They argued that while her beliefs were extreme, she was fully aware of her actions and their consequences. In the end, the jury sided with the defense. Deanna was found not guilty by reason of insanity and was committed to a state mental hospital. 2 decades later, the story of Deanna LaJune Laney continues to haunt those who lived through it. For the residents of New Chapel Hill, the tragedy serves as a stark reminder of the fragile boundary between faith and fanaticism, devotion and delusion. The Laney home has long since changed hands, its new occupants unaware of the horrors that once transpired within its walls. Yet for those who knew Deanna and her family, the memory remains inescapable, a chilling testament to the depths of human tragedy and the unpredictable nature of the human mind. In her quiet moments at the mental hospital, Deanna has reportedly expressed confusion and sorrow over her actions. Whether these feelings stem from genuine remorse or a fragmented recollection of events remains unclear. Deanna's case raises unsettling questions about the intersection of mental illness, religion, and accountability. How could someone so devoted to her children commit such an atrocity? Could the tragedy have been prevented if someone had recognized the warning signs earlier? And how do we, as a society, navigate the murky waters of faith-inspired violence? These are questions that linger long after the court verdict, questions that refuse to fade even as time moves forward. In the weeks and months following the tragedy, the people of New Chapel Hill struggled to make sense of the incomprehensible. Deanna had been one of their own, trusted, admired, and respected. Her actions shattered the town's collective trust, leaving behind a wound that even time seemed reluctant to heal. Church sermons began to take on a different tone. While some pastors preached forgiveness, emphasizing the need for understanding and compassion, others spoke of spiritual warfare, warning that Deanna's case was a cautionary tale of what could happen when faith spirals out of control. Congregants debated quietly in pews, grappling with whether Deanna had been a victim of mental illness or, as some feared, the influence of something far more sinister. Neighbors who once greeted the Laney family with warm smiles now avoided the house altogether. The once bustling home fell silent, its front yard a painful reminder of the lives lost there. Parents shielded their children from the story, but whispers lingered. The Laney boys were remembered in hushed tones, their names uttered with a mix of grief and disbelief. Keith Laney bore the brunt of the aftermath in a way that no one else could. As a husband, he had stood by Deanna through years of marriage, unaware of the storm brewing within her. As a father, he was now left to grapple with the unimaginable loss of 2 sons and the knowledge that his wife had been the one to take them. In interviews following the tragedy, Keith spoke of his heartbreak and confusion. He described Deanna as a loving mother who had always prioritized their children's happiness and well-being. "This wasn't her," he said in one tearful statement. "This wasn't the woman I married, the mother of my boys." Keith faced his own share of scrutiny. Some questioned whether he had ignored warning signs, while others blamed him for failing to intervene. But those closest to him insisted that Keith had been just as blindsided as everyone else. He had trusted Deanna, believed in her faith, and had no reason to suspect that her visions would lead to violence. For Keith, moving forward meant protecting the one child he still had, Aaron. The infant, spared from the carnage, became his sole focus. Determined to give Aaron a sense of normalcy, Keith relocated, leaving New Chapel Hill behind. But no matter where he went, the shadow of what had happened followed him. Aaron Laney, the youngest survivor of the tragedy, grew up without the brothers he would never truly know. As he aged, questions inevitably arose. Why had his mother been taken away? Why was his family different from others? Friends of the Laney family have reported that Keith shielded Aaron from the details for as long as possible. When Aaron was old enough to understand, Keith explained the events with careful honesty, ensuring his son knew that his mother's actions had been driven by illness, not hatred. Despite the horrors of his early childhood, Aaron reportedly grew into a well-adjusted young man, thanks to his father's unwavering support. However, the legacy of that night remains a part of his story, a reminder of the resilience required to move forward in the face of unimaginable tragedy. Deanna Laney's case reignited national conversations about mental health, particularly postpartum psychosis. Experts pointed out that while the condition is rare, its consequences can be catastrophic when left untreated. The intersection of Deanna's faith and her psychosis added another layer of complexity. Religious delusions are not uncommon in cases of severe mental illness, but in communities where faith is deeply ingrained, distinguishing between spiritual fervor and pathological behavior can be challenging. Organizations advocating for mental health awareness used the Laney case to push for better education and resources, particularly in rural areas like Smith County, where access to psychiatric care is limited. The tragedy underscored the need for early intervention and the importance of recognizing warning signs, even when they are cloaked in the language of faith. Deanna Laney has spent the years since the tragedy in a state mental hospital. By all accounts, she remains deeply religious, spending much of her time reading the Bible and attending therapy sessions. Reports from hospital staff suggest that Deanna struggles to reconcile her memories of that fateful night with her current understanding of reality. Some days she expresses deep sorrow for the loss of her children, while on others, she insists that she was simply following God's will. Her mental health has reportedly stabilized with treatment, but the question of whether she will ever be released remains a contentious one. While some argue that Deanna poses no threat in her current state, others believe that the severity of her crime warrants permanent confinement. The Laney case continues to be studied by criminologists, psychologists, and theologians alike. It serves as a stark reminder of how intertwined belief systems and mental health can become, especially in isolated or deeply religious communities. For some, Deanna's story is a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked fanaticism. For others, it is a heartbreaking example of what can happen when mental illness goes unnoticed and untreated. But for those who lived through it, Keith Laney, the residents of New Chapel Hill, and the families of the victims, it is a deeply personal tragedy that defies easy explanation. Today, New Chapel Hill has returned to its quiet routine. New families have moved in, and children once again play in the yards. But the memory of May 2003 lingers, a faint shadow over the town's otherwise sunny disposition. The Laney family's story continues to serve as a reminder of both the fragility of the human mind and the strength of the human spirit. It is a story of loss, resilience, and the enduring quest for understanding in the face of the unthinkable.